In the late 15th century, the English royal family prepared to welcome a Spanish princess as a new bride. This marriage was crucial. It promised immense financial and military power. However, the Spanish side imposed a strict condition. They demanded that the English king eliminate all potential rivals to the throne before they would agree to the marriage. This cold demand sealed the fate of Edward Plantagenet. He was the last legitimate heir of the previous king's bloodline. Despite being locked in prison for 14 years and having the mind of a child, he was still dragged to the execution ground. The life of this cognitively impaired young man was ultimately utilized as a brutal, non-negotiable geopolitical currency in exchange for the new Spanish bride. Born on February 25, 1475, Edward carried an ultimate political target on his back from the moment he drew his first breath. He was the nephew of two kings, Edward IV and Richard III. His father was George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence. His mother was Isabel Neville, the eldest daughter of the legendary, immensely wealthy and terrifying kingmaker Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. Edward possessed the direct, legitimate male bloodline of the Plantagenet dynasty. This was a formidable royal house that had ruled England with an iron grip for over 300 years. His story stands as a chilling, meticulously documented historical record of profound state-sponsored destruction. Edward's existence began at the absolute pinnacle of English society, but in the late 1400s, the top of the pyramid was precisely where the highest concentration of lethal violence occurred. He was born directly into the climax of the Wars of the Roses, a multi-generational civil bloodbath between the rival aristocratic factions of York and Lancaster that decimated the English nobility. In this hyper-paranoid environment, elite blood did not serve as a shield from harm. It actively invited assassination. The factions fighting for absolute control of the English state were more than willing to exterminate an entire family tree just to wipe a specific surname from the political map. The tragedy for Edward was that the architects of his early suffering were not foreign invaders or peasant rebels, but his own flesh and blood. In 1478, when Edward was merely 3 years old, his father, the Duke of Clarence, was convicted of high treason. The man who orchestrated this conviction was Clarence's own brother, King Edward IV. The Yorkist regime was violently cannibalizing itself. The Duke was privately executed within the Tower of London, famously rumored to have been drowned in a large barrel of Malmsey wine to avoid the public spectacle of a royal beheading. Edward's mother, Isabel Neville, had already passed away under suspicious, potentially poisonous circumstances just a year prior. By the age of 3, young Edward and his older sister Margaret Pole were entirely orphaned, their parents victims of the brutal internal politics of their own dynasty. In a functioning, empathetic society, an orphan toddler is surrounded by compassion, psychological care, and familial support. But in the pragmatic, unforgiving theater of royal succession, compassion was a fatal political weakness. As a boy with a direct, undeniable claim to the English throne, Edward was immediately converted into a pawn. After the sudden death of Richard's heir, Edward of Middleham, young Plantagenet briefly became the heir presumptive. He was the most important child in the kingdom. Yet, as Richard's paranoia grew, the political wind shifted and the boy was sidelined once more. Edward spent his early childhood heavily guarded at Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire, a vast northern stronghold controlled by the king. He was not raised in a traditional sense. He was securely stored. He was kept under strict, relentless surveillance by a garrison of armed loyalists, functioning as a living, breathing chess piece waiting for the adults around him to decide his ultimate political utility. The definitive end of Edward's limited freedom and the beginning of his lifelong systematic nightmare arrived in the sweltering summer of 1485. King Richard III was hacked to death in the mud at the Battle of Bosworth Field. This catastrophic military event signaled the abrupt, violent end of the Plantagenet dynasty. It simultaneously marked the sudden rise of Henry Tudor, a relatively obscure exile who seized the crown by right of conquest and crowned himself King Henry VII. This transfer of power was effectively an unwritten death sentence for young Edward Plantagenet. The calculated, systemic, and unusual cruelty Henry VII unleashed upon a 10-year-old boy directly stemmed from the paralyzing, deep-seated constitutional insecurity that completely consumed the new king. Henry VII had seized the crown through raw military force and foreign backing, not through a clean, unassailable legal right. His royal lineage was traced through the Beaufort family on his mother's side. The Beauforts were an originally illegitimate branch of the House of Lancaster that had explicitly been barred from inheriting the throne by previous legally binding acts of Parliament. Henry's legal claim to the throne was incredibly weak, controversial among the established nobility, and vulnerable to the slightest constitutional challenge. He was an upstart sitting on a throne built entirely on recent bloodshed. Henry VII was a remarkably intelligent, cold, and relentlessly pragmatic statesman. He recognized a terrifying constitutional reality the moment the crown was placed on his head. His newly established Tudor regime could never be truly secure as long as the legitimate legal heir of the overthrown dynasty was still breathing. From a purely legal and genealogical standpoint, the 10-year-old Edward Plantagenet possessed a claim to the throne that was overwhelmingly superior to Henry's. Edward didn't need to possess a weapon. He did not need to recruit an army of mercenaries. He did not need to utter a single word of defiance against the Tudor regime. The simple, undeniable fact of his existence was enough to destabilize the government. As long as Edward's heart was beating and Plantagenet blood pumped through his veins, any disgruntled lord, any ambitious foreign monarch, or any Yorkist loyalist had a perfectly legal, legitimate figurehead to rally around. The boy's mere physical presence was a lit match hovering over the combustible powder keg of Henry's new kingdom. The new king required an immediate, absolute solution to the existential threat residing at Sheriff Hutton Castle. The violence deployed by a centralized, authoritarian regime does not always require the theatrical swing of an executioner's axe or the public spectacle of a battlefield. Often, the most horrific acts of state cruelty are conducted in total, suffocating silence, operating entirely outside the parameters of established law. Almost immediately after winning the crown at the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485, King Henry VII demonstrated a chilling understanding of threat neutralization. Before he even secured the capital city of London, before the blood had fully dried on the battlefield, and before his coronation was formally arranged, one of his very first executive orders was a targeted military operation. He dispatched Sir Robert Willoughby, a trusted and ruthless loyalist, to ride rapidly north to Sheriff Hutton Castle. The mission assigned to Willoughby was surgical, immediate, and completely devoid of legal pretense. Capture the 10-year-old Edward Plantagenet. An objective historical analysis of this exact moment reveals the absolute terrifying suspension of basic civil rights. Edward Plantagenet was a child. He had never participated in a battle. He had never signed a document declaring himself the rightful king. He had raised no banners, recruited no soldiers, and taken absolutely no hostile actions whatsoever against the newly established Tudor government. Yet when Willoughby's armed retinue arrived at the gates of Sheriff Hutton, there was no public warrant issued for the boy's arrest. There was no formal indictment presented to a magistrate. There was no trial, no legal representation offered to the child, and no bill of attainder presented to Parliament to officially strip him of his titles and rights. The Tudor state apparatus utilized unilateral, overwhelming military force to simply erase a child from the civilian world. Edward was quietly escorted out of the fortress in Yorkshire, separated from any remaining loyal retainers, and transported south under heavy armed guard. He was marched through the gates of the Tower of London, and the heavy iron portcullis slammed shut behind him. Modern legal historians and constitutional experts examining the administrative records of Henry VII's early reign recognize this event as one of the most extreme, perfectly executed examples of extrajudicial detention in English history. The Crown made a deliberate, calculated decision to execute what can only be described as a civil deletion. The state needed to physically sever every single logistical, social, and political tie between the boy and the outside world. By plunging him into a black hole within the state's most secure fortress, the government ensured that no Yorkist rebel, no foreign ambassador, and no sympathetic nobleman could ever reach him, communicate with him, or use his physical presence to legitimize a rebellion. A critical historical question arises. If King Henry VII viewed the boy as such a massive threat to the Tudor dynasty, why did he not simply order Willoughby to execute the child at Sheriff Hutton? Why endure the immense logistical expense and political risk of housing the true heir to the throne in the capital city for over a decade? The answer lies in the sophisticated public relations calculus of Henry VII. The new king was acutely aware of the fragile political ecos Istemi had just conquered. He understood that raw power was insufficient. He required the consent, or at least the passive compliance, of the English nobility and the common populace. Henry was forced to navigate the immediate toxic political ghost of his predecessor, Richard III. Richard's reign had been permanently crippled by the widespread assumption that he had murdered his own nephews, the infamous princes in the Tower, King Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, to secure his throne. Henry Tudor had heavily weaponized this narrative during his rebellion, utilizing the presumed murder of the innocent princes to paint Richard as an illegitimate child-killing monster. If Henry VII, immediately upon seizing power, ordered his guards to execute or physically torture another innocent orphaned royal child, he would instantly become the exact monster he claimed to have defeated. The hypocrisy would be undeniable. The English public, exhausted by decades of aristocratic slaughter, would erupt in absolute outrage. Bruises, broken bones, or a sudden unexplained death would instantly transform young Edward into a powerful, untouchable martyr. A tortured or murdered child would draw widespread public sympathy across all factional lines and actively trigger the very rebellions Henry was so desperate to prevent. The Tudor state was trapped in a unique logistical paradox. They needed Edward alive to prevent his sister, Margaret Pole, or another distant Yorkist relative from legally inheriting his claim to the throne and passing it to a foreign power through marriage. However, they simultaneously needed Edward to exist in a state of absolute permanent harmlessness. The boy had to be kept alive, but he had to be completely neutralized politically, intellectually, and socially. To achieve this unprecedented goal, the Tudor government did not utilize the rack, the thumbscrews, or the executioner's block. Instead, they subjected the child to a methodical, deeply sinister regime of educational and social deprivation. The Tower of London was a sprawling complex, serving simultaneously as a royal palace, a mint, an armory, and a state prison. Edward was not housed in the luxurious royal apartments, nor was he thrown into a damp, disease-ridden dungeon where he might quickly die of dysentery, which would have created the very public relations crisis Henry sought to avoid. He was placed in a secure, heavily monitored cell. While not a dark dungeon, Edward was systematically isolated from standard human interaction. The Crown implemented a containment strategy designed to restrict his environment and halt his mental growth. He was strictly forbidden from interacting with anyone other than a vetted rotating cadre of specifically assigned jailers. These guards operated under draconian state-mandated orders. The protocols governing their interaction with the boy were absolute. They were strictly forbidden to speak to him in any conversational manner. They were forbidden to show him any physical or emotional affection. They were ordered to provide no information whatsoever about the outside world, the political state of England, his family, or his own identity. In a standard noble household, a boy of Edward's exalted rank would be surrounded by tutors. He would be aggressively educated in Latin, French, theology, military strategy, mathematics, and the complex protocols of courtly behavior. This education was essential for the cognitive development of the ruling class. The Tudor state deliberately stripped Edward of his right to cognitive development. He was provided no tutors, no books, and no social interaction. Instead of the rigorous education expected of a royal duke, he was subjected to a quiet, isolated routine. Over 14 years, this intentional starvation of intellectual stimuli systematically halted his mental development, effectively trapping his mind at the age of 10. The physical fallout of this confinement was striking. Over the course of his imprisonment, nature took its inevitable course on his body. The 10-year-old boy slowly grew, his bones lengthened, his voice deepened, and he developed into a physically mature 24-year-old man. But his cognitive abilities remained firmly stunted. The full, horrifying extent of this destruction was documented by the Tudor chronicler Edward Hall. Hall, writing with the hindsight of the era, recorded that the Earl of Warwick had been kept so completely isolated from all human company, from the sight of beasts and from the natural world, that he was reduced to a state of severe cognitive disability. Hall famously and tragically noted in his chronicles that the young man could not discern a goose from a capon. The pathology of this condition was clear. This was not a congenital birth defect. Edward Plantagenet was not born with an impairment. This severe degradation was the calculated result of state-sponsored neglect. Henry VII achieved his ultimate security objective without spilling a single drop of blood. The state guaranteed that even if motivated, well-funded, sympathetic rebels managed to breach the Tower of London and break Edward out of his cell, the boy would be functionally, politically, and militarily useless to them. Because of his forced isolation, Edward lacked the basic language skills to inspire followers. He possessed zero logical reasoning to formulate strategy. He lacked the mental sharpness required to lead an army, negotiate a treaty, or govern a nation. The state had successfully hollowed out the legitimate heir to the throne, leaving nothing but an empty shell carrying a dangerous surname. However, history is full of bitter, violent ironies. The Tudor regime believed that by burying the boy alive and silencing him completely, they had solved the Plantagenet problem. They failed to realize that by hiding Edward so completely, they had created a volatile information vacuum across the European continent, a vacuum that would soon trigger on any of the most bizarre, dangerous, and destabilizing military crises of King Henry VII's entire reign. The Tudor strategy of total containment, burying the 10-year-old Edward within the deepest architecture of the Tower, was a masterpiece of state security. By executing a civil deletion, King Henry VII believed he had neutralized the threat without incurring the public relations disaster of a royal execution. However, this strategy relied on a fundamental misunderstanding of political physics. In the complex, volatile geopolitical ecosystem of the late 15th century, absolute secrecy did not generate stability. It generated an information vacuum. And in the high-stakes theater of royal succession, a vacuum of verifiable truth will immediately be weaponized by political opportunists. The catastrophic blowback of Henry VII's detention policy was fundamentally triggered by the unique constrained mechanics of information distribution across 1480s Europe. In an era completely lacking mass communication, the physical visibility of a monarch or an heir was the sole definitive proof of their continued existence. The English populace, the disgruntled Yorkist nobility, and the hyper-vigilant foreign ambassadors residing in London relied entirely on visual confirmation during state banquets, parliamentary openings, and religious processions to gauge the stability of the realm. When Edward Plantagenet was swallowed by the Tower in 1485 and subsequently vanished from all public registers, the Tudor state offered no official explanation regarding his living conditions. They issued no health bulletins and permitted no independent aristocratic observers to verify his welfare. This absolute silence instantly activated the collective trauma of the English public. Less than 3 years prior, the public had witnessed the exact same operational pattern under King Richard III. 2 royal boys, the princes in the Tower, had been placed under heavy guard in the fortress and simply disappear, dead from human sight, widely presumed to have been murdered in their sleep. When Henry VII applied the identical methodology to Edward Plantagenet, the populace and the European courts naturally reached the identical, logical conclusion. By the winter of 1486, rampant, uncontrollable rumors saturated the capital and bled across the English Channel. The consensus was that the new pragmatic Tudor king had secretly ordered the boy's assassination in the dark to secure his fragile throne. Henry VII had inadvertently engineered the exact crisis he sought to avoid. By turning the legitimate Yorkist heir into an unconfirmed ghost, he effectively handed his political enemies a blank canvas. If the real Edward Plantagenet was dead, or at least presumed dead by the masses, the Yorkist faction could simply manufacture a new one. The resulting crisis, known to history as the Lambert-Simnel Rebellion, stands as one of the most bizarre, audacious, and militarily dangerous episodes in English history. It was a direct, systemic reaction to the information vacuum created by Edward's extrajudicial detention. The conspiracy did not originate within the highest echelons of the surviving Yorkist nobility. It was initiated by a rogue, ambitious Oxford priest named Richard Simon. He recognized the untapped energy of the Yorkist cause, which lacked only a dynastic figurehead to mobilize. Operating on the widespread assumption that the real Earl of Warwick had been murdered in the Tower, Simon decided to artificially supply the missing figurehead. Simon acquired a young working-class boy named Lambert Simnel. The precise socioeconomic origins of Simnel are debated. He was likely the son of a baker, an organ builder, or a tradesman, but his aristocratic bloodline was definitively non-existent. However, the boy possessed physical traits that made the deception viable. He was roughly the same age as the vanished Edward Plantagenet, and he reportedly possessed a dignified, handsome bearing that could be polished into a royal facade. The priest subjected the working-class boy to an intensive, specific curriculum of behavioral modification. Simon trained Simnel to walk with the straight-backed arrogance of the peerage, to speak with refined aristocratic diction, and to recite the complex genealogy of the House of York. Simnel was drilled on the layout of Sheriff Hutton Castle, and the names of the retainers who had served the real Edward before his abduction. Simon's choice to have the boy impersonate the Earl of Warwick was a stroke of tactical genius. If he had chosen to impersonate one of the missing princes in the Tower, the public would have demanded to know where the boy had been hiding for the past 4 years. But Edward Plantagenet had only recently vanished into the Tudor prison system. The narrative Simon constructed was compelling, perfectly tailored to the anti-Tudor sentiment of the era. He claimed that sympathetic guards had miraculously smuggled the young Earl out of the Tower of London, replacing him with a decoy, and that the true, legitimate heir of the Plantagenets was now ready to reclaim his stolen kingdom. A rogue priest and a brainwashed baker's son constituted a localized fraud. The Tudor state possessed the domestic policing capability to crush such a minor disturbance. However, the power of Edward Plantagenet's stolen identity was so immense, and the hatred for Henry VII's upstart regime was so profound, that the fraud rapidly escalated into an international geopolitical crisis. Recognizing that he could not launch a rebellion from within the heavily policed English mainland, Richard Simon smuggled the impostor across the Irish Sea. Late 15th century Ireland, specifically the Pale surrounding Dublin, operated as a semi-autonomous Yorkist stronghold. It was controlled by the formidable Gerald Fitzgerald, the 8th Earl of Kildare. Kildare was an experienced, ruthless political operator. When Simon presented the impostor to the Irish lords, it is highly probable that Kildare, possessing a sophisticated intelligence network, recognized the boy was a fake. But the true lineage of the child was entirely irrelevant to the political utility of the child. Simnel provided the Irish lords with the exact legal pretext they required to declare war on the Tudor regime and secure their own absolute autonomy. On May 24, 1487, in an act of breathtaking institutional defiance, the working-class impostor was officially crowned as King Edward VI of England in Christchurch Cathedral, Dublin. The highest-ranking bishops in Ireland anointed him, and the powerful Anglo-Irish nobility swore formal oaths of fealty to a phantom. The crisis immediately breached international borders. The surviving Yorkist diaspora in Europe, severely marginalized by Henry VII, rallied to the impostor's banner. The most critical external player was Margaret of York, the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy. As the sister of the late Kings Edward IV and Richard III, she was the biological aunt of the real Edward Plantagenet. Margaret of Burgundy possessed immense personal wealth, deep diplomatic networks, and an absolute unyielding hatred for the Tudor regime that had slaughtered her brother at Bosworth. Much like the Earl of Kildare, Margaret likely harbored deep suspicions regarding the identity of the boy in Dublin. Yet she recognized the boy as the ultimate battering ram to smash the Tudor throne. She opened the lucrative Burgundian treasury and bankrolled the rebellion. Margaret hired Martin Schwartz, a feared and experienced German mercenary commander, along with 2,000 elite, heavily armored Swiss and German Landsknechts. She dispatched this formidable professional army alongside a fleet of ships to rendezvous with the impostor in Ireland. Furthermore, legitimate English aristocrats, including John de la Pole, the Earl of Lincoln, who was actually a cousin of the real Edward and had spent time with him, fled the English court and joined the rebellion. Lincoln knew without a shadow of a doubt that Simnel was a fraud, but he utilized the impostor as a convenient front to overthrow Henry, likely intending to seize the throne for himself once the Tudor king was dead. By keeping the real Edward hidden, Henry allowed a working-class boy in Dublin to raise a vast, internationally funded mercenary army. This force was now preparing to invade the English mainland. The Tudor regime was facing an existential threat based entirely on a ghost story. Henry VII's intelligence network provided him with the exact details of the Yorkist narrative. They were claiming the Earl of Warwick had escaped. Henry recognized that combating a manufactured lie required tangible physical proof. Issuing legal proclamations denouncing the boy in Dublin as a fraud was administratively useless. The public would simply view the denials as standard Tudor propaganda. To break the illusion and legally invalidate the impending invasion, the king was forced into an act of supreme macabre state theater. He had to drag the real, deeply disoriented Edward Plantagenet out of his dungeon and parade him in front of the world. In February 1487, the Tudor state organized a publicized, heavily guarded procession through the densely populated streets of London. The objective was to march Edward from the secure confines of the Tower of London to St. Paul's Cathedral, ensuring maximum visual exposure to the citizens, the nobility, and the foreign diplomatic corps. The true, horrifying tragedy of this public event becomes fully apparent only when evaluated directly through the shattered reality of the victim. Edward Plantagenet had been locked in a silent room since he was 10 years old. He had seen no natural light beyond the barred windows of his cell. He had experienced no chaotic noise, no crowds, and no social interaction beyond the stony faces of his assigned jailers. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors were thrown open. The bewildered boy, now roughly 12 years old, W, as dressed in fine, high-status clothing that he likely did not recognize or understand, he was thrust out into the blinding winter light and forced to walk through the freezing, chaotic, and deafeningly loud streets of the capital city. Thousands of Londoners, merchants, and minor nobles lined the streets to see the last male heir of the great legendary Plantagenet dynasty. They expected to see a fierce, charismatic young prince, a boy who possessed the regal bearing of his uncle, King Edward IV, or the martial intensity of his grandfather, the Kingmaker. Instead, the public witnessed a tragedy of state engineering. They saw a vacant-eyed, utterly passive young boy who clearly possessed absolutely no comprehension of the crowds, the architecture of the city, or his own political identity. Edward was paraded like a captured exotic animal. When the procession reached St. Paul's Cathedral, the king escalated the psychological theater. He ordered the high-ranking nobility, including those suspected of harboring Yorkist sympathies, to physically approach the boy and engage him in conversation. The objective was to definitively prove that the boy in state custody was the real Earl of Warwick, and therefore the boy in Ireland was a manufactured lie. The conversations at St. Paul's Cathedral laid bare the devastating reality of his fractured mind. Edward could not articulate sentences. He could not engage in the stylized, formal political banter expected of a royal duke. He could not inquire about the state of the realm or recognize the men who had once served his father. He stood in the magnificent cathedral surrounded by the most powerful men in England, staring blankly, a bewildered child trapped in a terrifying, incomprehensible spectacle. The macabre parade was a public relations success, but a military failure. By exposing the hollowed-out reality of the real Edward, Henry VII successfully convinced the vast majority of the domestic English populace that the boy in Irel and was a fraud. Consequently, when the rebel army finally crossed the sea and landed in Lancashire in June 1487, they failed to trigger the widespread grassroots public uprising they had anticipated. The English commoners, having seen the vacant eyes of the real Warwick, refused to bleed for the impostor Simnel. However, the visual proof of Edward's existence did not stop the hardened mercenary army or the ambitious Yorkist lords. The Earl of Lincoln and Martin Schwartz did not care about the truth. They cared about regime change. The crisis culminated on June 16th, 1487, at the bloody Battle of Stoke Field. The Tudor royal army, vastly outnumbering the rebels, but facing elite, disciplined German and Swiss infantry, engaged in a brutal 3-hour slaughter. The battle was ultimately a decisive victory for Henry VII. The Earl of Lincoln was killed in the mud. Martin Schwartz and his mercenaries were annihilated. The rogue priest Richard Simon was captured and sentenced to life imprisonment. In a characteristic display of cold, calculated Tudor pragmatism, King Henry VII did not execute the impostor, Lambert Simnel. Recognizing that the boy was merely a brainwashed prop utilized by older, dangerous men, Henry officially pardoned the child. To maximize the public humiliation of the Yorkist cause, the king gave the King Edward VI of Ireland a job working as a lowly spit boy in the royal kitchens, turning the figurehead of a vast rebellion into a domestic servant roasting meat for the Tudor court. Yet, while the impostor was granted a long life in the royal kitchens, the real victim of the crisis was immediately shoved back into the abyss. The moment the public relations objective at St. Paul's Cathedral was achieved, the heavy armed escort closed back around Edward Plantagenet. He was marched away from the cathedral, back through the chaotic streets, and immediately returned to his isolated cell within the Tower of London. The heavy doors were locked, and the darkness resa. Umed. For King Henry VII, the Lambert Simnel rebellion provided a terrifying, unassailable political lesson. Parading the real Edward had prevented a domestic uprising, but it had entirely failed to stop the military invasion from abroad. The Yorkist lords and foreign enemies did not require Edward to be intelligent, capable, or even free to utilize him as a weapon of mass destruction. Henry VII recognized that the strategy of extrajudicial detention had proven insufficient to secure the Tudor dynasty. The king realized that the only permanent solution to the threat was physical termination. He simply had to wait for the geopolitical environment to provide a legally defensible excuse to execute the slaughter. The immense systemic pressures that forced the Tudor state to transition from illegal detention to state-sponsored assassination were completely rooted in Henry VII's overarching geopolitical objective: unassailable dynastic legitimacy. Henry VII had seized the English throne by right of conquest, a mechanism that was effective in the short term but inherently unstable in the long term. In the stratified, deeply interconnected diplomatic ecosystem of Renaissance Europe, a monarch was not considered truly legitimate simply because he possessed an army and a crown. True legitimacy, the kind of legitimacy that deterred foreign invasions, secured lucrative international trade monopolies, and guaranteed the peaceful succession of heirs, required the formal, enthusiastic recognition of the established European superpowers. For the Tudor dynasty to survive beyond Henry's own lifetime, it needed to be grafted onto the ancient, unassailable royal family trees of the continent. Henry required a premier international alliance cemented by a royal marriage. In the late 15th century, the geopolitical center of gravity in Europe had shifted decisively southward to the Iberian Peninsula. Spain, recently unified by the marriage of the fiercely pragmatic Catholic monarchs, King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, had emerged as the undisputed superpower of the continent. Ferdinand and Isabella were in the process of concluding the centuries-long Reconquista, systematically driving the last Moorish strongholds from the peninsula. They were funding expeditions that would soon unlock the unimaginable wealth of the New World. They possessed elite, modernized military forces and a sprawling, sophisticated diplomatic intelligence network that cast a shadow over all of Western Europe. Henry VII recognized that securing a permanent, ironclad alliance with Spain was the ultimate political prize. It would provide the upstart Tudor regime with a powerful diplomatic shield against their primary traditional enemy, the Kingdom of France. Consequently, Henry dedicated immense diplomatic resources to negotiating a marriage treaty between his eldest son and heir, Arthur, Prince of Wales, and the youngest daughter of the Catholic monarchs, Catherine of Aragon. The negotiations for the marriage of Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon began when the children were merely infants. The diplomatic correspondence surrounding these negotiations, notably the dispatches sent by the Spanish ambassador to London, Rodrigo de Puebla, provides a chilling, unvarnished look at how the European superpowers viewed the Tudor regime. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were incredibly ruthless, unsentimental political operators. They did not view international diplomacy through the lens of chivalry or abstract friendship. They viewed it strictly as a mechanism for risk management and asset acquisition. When they deployed their intelligence network to evaluate the English political landscape, they did not see a secure, thriving kingdom ready to be a reliable military partner. They saw a deeply unstable, volatile island nation prone to endless, cyclical civil wars. They had observed the violent overthrow of King Henry VI, the sudden usurpation by Richard III, and the bloody conquest by Henry VII. They were acutely aware of the Lambert-Simnel rebellion and the continuous simmering Yorkist plots that plagued the Tudor court. From the perspective of the Spanish crown, sending their valuable daughter, a princess of Spain, into this toxic environment was an unacceptable geopolitical risk. If Catherine of Aragon married Prince Arthur, and the Tudor regime was subsequently overthrown by a Yorkist uprising, the Spanish princess could be imprisoned, executed, or forced into a degrading political marriage by the conquering faction. The Spanish diplomatic archives reveal a chilling, unyielding stance from the Catholic monarchs, as the timeline for the marriage treaty accelerated and the physical relocation of teenage Princess Catherine to England became imminent. Ferdinand and Isabella explicitly weaponized their diplomatic leverage. Through their ambassadors, they delivered a definitive, uncompromising ultimatum to King Henry VII. The specific phrasing utilized in these diplomatic exchanges is critical. The Spanish demanded that there remain not a drop of doubtful royal blood in the English kingdom. This was not a vague request for general domestic security. In the coded, precise language of Renaissance diplomacy, this was a direct, specific demand for the physical extermination of Edward Plantagenet. The Spanish crown recognized perfectly well that Edward, regardless of his confinement, possessed a superior legal claim to the throne. Ferdinand and Isabella effectively outsourced their risk management to Henry VII, making the execution of the Earl of Warwick a mandatory prerequisite for the alliance. This unrelenting diplomatic pressure forced the Tudor regime into an unprecedented legal dilemma. The state's foundational strategy of silent containment was no longer sufficient. To secure his dynasty's future, Henry VII needed to produce a corpse. However, Henry VII was fundamentally an administrative king, deeply obsessed with the architecture of the law. He understood that he could not simply command his guards to walk into the Tower of London, drag an unaccused man out of his cell, and openly execute him without cause. Doing so would violate the fundamental strictures of English common law and Magna Carta. It would instantly expose Henry to the domestic public and the international community as a lawless, bloodthirsty tyrant, the exact reputation he had spent 15 years trying to avoid. More dangerously, arbitrarily executing the last male Plantagenet heir without a trial would likely ignite the very widespread aristocratic civil war that the Spanish were trying to avoid. The English nobility, even those loyal to Henry, would realize that if the king could legally murder a royal duke without cause, none of their own lives or estates were safe from sovereign overreach. The crown needed a legally watertight, publicly defensible excuse to kill the Earl of Warwick. They needed him to commit a crime so severe that the execution would appear as an act of necessary state justice rather than a cynical political assassination. They needed to manufacture an act of high treason. The logistical solution to Henry VII's legal paradox arrived in the form of a second, far more sophisticated impostor who had plagued the Tudor regime for nearly a decade: Perkin Warbeck. Unlike the crude, easily disproven Lambert Simnel, Perkin Warbeck was a polished, heavily funded political operative. Originating from Tournai, Warbeck had spent the 1490s traveling across the courts of Europe, claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes, in the Tower, who had supposedly survived his uncle Richard III's assassination attempt. Warbeck had successfully secured the backing of Margaret of Burgundy, the King of Scotland, and the Holy Roman Emperor. He had launched multiple armed incursions into England and Ireland, causing severe financial and military disruption to the Tudor state. However, by 1497, Warbeck, as rebellion finally collapsed, he was captured by Henry's forces, forced to publicly confess to his true identity as a Flemish boatman's son, and was eventually transferred to the Tower of London in 1498. The simultaneous presence of Perkin Warbeck and Edward Plantagenet within the identical architectural confines of the Tower of London provided the Tudor Privy Council with the exact raw materials required to construct a lethal legal mechanism. The Tudor state apparatus, recognizing the necessity of fulfilling the Spanish ultimatum, constructed an elaborate, profoundly cynical entrapment scheme right inside the walls of the state's most secure facility. The operation was a flawless execution of institutionalized cruelty, meticulously designed to legally sanitize a straightforward political assassination. The first phase of the entrapment was logistical. In 1498, the Crown intentionally relocated Perkin Warbeck into a cell directly adjacent to, or situated directly beneath, the quarters holding Edward Plantagenet. This spatial rearrangement was not a matter of administrative convenience. It was a deliberate breach of the strict isolation protocols that had governed Edward's existence for 13 years. By placing the charismatic, articulate political agitator in close proximity to the deeply traumatized Earl, the state established the necessary geographical foundation for a conspiracy. However, simply placing the two men near each other was insufficient. The state knew that Edward lacked the capacity to initiate a plot, and Warbeck was heavily monitored. To ensure a conspiracy was formed, documented, and legally actionable, the government introduced active agents into the ecosystem. The Crown deployed undercover operatives to act as agents provocateurs within the prison block. Historical records identify two primary operators, Thomas Astwood and Robert Clemount. These men were not standard uniformed jailers. They were sophisticated intelligence assets acting under the Debo's direct clandestine orders of the king's ministers. Their operational directive was to pose as friendly, sympathetic guards or disaffected servants who secretly harbored Yorkist loyalties. The ethical and moral bankruptcy of this operation is staggering. Astwood and Clemount spent months meticulously infiltrating the environment of a man whose mind had been broken since he was 10 years old. Having spent his formative years in isolation, Edward was completely defenseless against psychological manipulation. When Astwood and Clemount approached him with feigned warmth and whispered promises of freedom, the naive young man easily trusted them. The agents provocateurs did not require Edward to mastermind a rebellion. They did not need him to draft letters, design siege tactics, or recruit followers. The legal threshold for treason, specifically the statute concerning compassing or imagining the death of the king, did not require the successful execution of violence. It only required the legally verifiable agreement to participate in a violent conspiracy. Therefore, the state agents actively constructed the conspiracy themselves and simply fed the lines to the prisoner. Astwood and Clemount functioned as the communicative bridge between Perkin Warbeck and Edward Plantagenet. They facilitated the exchange of messages, often passing through gaps in the floorboards or during coordinated exercise periods. They whispered into Edward's ear, fabricating a complex imaginary plot of escape. They explicitly outlined the parameters of this phantom conspiracy. They proposed that sympathetic forces within the tower would rise up, overpower the loyal guards, and seize control of the fortress. They detailed a plan to violently blow up the tower's armory using smuggled gunpowder to create a diversion. They outlined the subsequent theft of the royal treasury stored within the keep. Finally, they detailed the ultimate objective: to assassinate King Henry VII, escape the capital, flee to the Anne, or to Flanders, and incite a national revolution to place the true heirs back on the throne. The agents provocateurs actively encouraged the man to interact with Warbeck's proposals. They manipulated his childish desire to leave the dark cell, framing the violent coup simply as a mechanism to go home. All the state required from Edward Plantagenet was a verbal affirmation, a nod of the head, or the acceptance of a smuggled token from Warbeck to legally bind him to the conspiracy. By the late summer of 1499, the Tudor intelligence apparatus determined they had extracted sufficient actionable evidence from the entrapment operation. The Spanish diplomatic pressure had reached a critical threshold, and the king required the execution to proceed. In August 1499, the state abruptly and violently pulled the snare shut. The illusion of the sympathetic guards evaporated. The cells were raided, and the conspiracy was officially exposed to the King's Privy Council. Astwood and Clemoun, acting their parts perfectly, confessed their involvement and provided the state with the meticulous, documented testimony of the plot, heavily implicating both Perkin Warbeck and, crucially, the Earl of Warwick. The state officially accused a prisoner who had spent 14 years in absolute isolation. Blatantly ignoring his profound cognitive impairment, the Crown charged a man who could barely hold a standard conversation with masterminding a sophisticated military coup and executing a complex prison break. The issuance of the formal indictment against Edward Plantagenet in November 1499 marked the transition of the Tudor state's operation from clandestine entrapment to public judicial theater. The government had successfully manufactured the narrative of a sophisticated military conspiracy. The final requirement was to process this fabrication through the established mechanisms of English common law, thereby sanitizing a geopolitical assassination under the veneer of state justice. Execute an aristocratic peer of the realm. The Crown could not utilize a standard criminal court. The legal proceedings required the convening of the court of the Lord High Steward, a specialized tribunal where the accused was judged by a jury of his aristocratic equals. The selection of the personnel to preside over this tribunal exposes the entirely predetermined nature of the verdict. King Henry VII appointed John de Vere, the 13th Earl of Oxford, to act as the Lord High Steward and preside over the trial. The Earl of Oxford was not an impartial jurist. He was one of the primary military architects of the Tudor regime, a staunch, unyielding Lancastrian loyalist who had commanded the vanguard of Henry's army at the Battle of Bosworth. The jury of 22 peers selected to hear the case was similarly composed of men whose titles, lands, and continued prosperity were directly tethered to the survival of the Tudor dynasty. To acquit the Earl of Warwick would be to directly challenge the security parameters set by the king and the Spanish Empire. The tribunal was not assembled to weigh evidence. It was assembled to provide administrative validation to a sovereign directive. When Edward Plantagenet was hauled before this assembly, the structural failure of the English justice system became absolute. In the jurisprudence of the late 15th century, rudimentary legal concepts regarding a defendant's competency to stand trial already existed. The doctrine of non compos mentis, not of sound mind, theoretically protected individuals who lacked the capacity to understand their crimes or the legal proceedings against them. However, during this choreographed trial, the issue of the defendant's profound incapacity was systematically suppressed. No legal counsel was appointed to argue that a man subjected to such extreme, prolonged sensory deprivation lacked the baseline intellectual functionality required to orchestrate a complex, treasonous plot involving explosives and INTI, or national regime change. The state required a clean, legally unassailable administrative record to present to the Spanish ambassadors, and acknowledging the prisoner's state-induced condition would have instantly invalidated the indictment. The official court transcripts record a single devastating detail. Edward Plantagenet pleaded guilty to all charges. Analyzing this plea reveals the profound exploitation of the state's victim. For a man who possessed no understanding of Tudor jurisprudence, the statutory definition of treason, or the irrevocable finality of a capital sentence, this legal confession was completely devoid of comprehension. The extraction of this guilty plea was almost certainly the final phase of the psychological manipulation initiated by the state's agents provocateurs in the Tower. The interrogators and guards, having already established a dynamic of misplaced trust with the naive prisoner, likely instructed him to simply agree to the charges read by the clerk. They may have utilized coercion, intense environmental pressure, or gentle fabricated promises, assuring the bewildered young man that if he merely repeated the affirmative words required by the court, the king would grant him clemency and finally permit him to leave his cell. By securing a guilty plea, the Tudor administration circumvented the need to present witnesses, cross-examine the agents provocateurs, or publicly debate the flawed logistics of the phantom conspiracy. The English justice system was completely subverted, functioning not as a shield for the vulnerable, but as an efficient administrative tool for political extermination. The Earl of Oxford, fulfilling his designated role, formally pronounced the sentence of death. The logistics of a state execution in the Tudor era were heavily ritualized, designed to serve as a public demonstration of the monarch's absolute power and the restoration of civic order. On the cold morning of November the 28th, 1499, the state mobilized to carry out its final objective regarding the Plantagenet line. The 24-year-old Edward Plantagenet was extracted from the silent confines of the Tower of London and guided by armed guards up the incline to the permanent executioner's block situated at Tower Hill. The physical reality of this final walk represented a violent, overwhelming shift for the condemned man. For a man who had lived in near total isolation for the preceding 14 years, the environmental shift was absolute. The sudden exposure to the open winter sky, the freezing wind, the chaotic architecture of the Capitol, and the deafening roar of thousands of gathered spectators would have constituted a terrifying, incomprehensible sensory overload. The behavior of the condemned upon the scaffold was a critical component of Tudor political theater. Standard aristocratic executions featured a regulated final speech. The condemned nobleman was expected to utilize his final moments to publicly confess his sins, assert his theological compliance, and, crucially, validate the legitimacy of the monarch who had ordered his death, thereby securing the future prospects of his surviving family members. Alternatively, a defiant rebel might attempt to use the platform to assert his innocence or the righteousness of his cause. Edward Plantagenet offered no such speech. He did not passionately assert his superior legal right to the throne of England. He did not curse King Henry VII, nor did he attempt to explain the entrapment orchestrated by the guards. Historical accounts of the execution note his quiet, passive compliance. He displayed no resistance and offered no political rhetoric. He likely possessed no real understanding of why the vast crowd was staring at him, why the armed guards surrounded him, or why the masked executioner was instructing him to kneel in the sawdust. He displayed only the bewildered obedience of a mind that had been systematically broken by the state over a decade prior. When the heavy steel, or blade of the executioner's axe finally fell, it accomplished far more than the physical termination of an innocent victim. That single state-sanctioned stroke fundamentally altered the genealogical landscape of European history. The execution permanently severed the legitimate, direct male line of the Angevin and Plantagenet dynasties. This was the ancient, formidable bloodline that had produced King Richard the Lionheart, King Edward I, and King Henry V. It was a dynasty that had shaped the legal, territorial, and cultural foundations of England for over 3 centuries. The culmination of that immense historical legacy ended not on a glorious battlefield, but on a wooden block extinguished by a fabricated legal technicality designed to satisfy a diplomatic quota. The Grand Spanish Alliance, purchased with Warwick's life, eventually collapsed. Prince Arthur died shortly after the marriage, leaving Catherine of Aragon to his brother, Henry VIII. Decades later, as her marriage dissolved in the chaos of the English Reformation, Catherine believed her downfall was divine judgment. She remained haunted by one horrific realization. Her royal union had been irrevocably made in blood, the innocent blood of Edward Plantagenet.